I had hoped that we would all be able to smell the bread baking in the back corner of the tab. Can you smell it up your way? Is there the smell of bread behind you? One person. Excellent. Excellent. Because the idea was that we were going to have a sensory experience, not only of talking, not only of visuals, but maybe we could have the smell of bread. Hot bread reminds me of God. Freshly cut grass reminds me of God. The smell of rain on a tarmac and then the heat evaporating, the water evaporating off, reminds me of God. These little moments of what I would call creativity, little spotlights of creativity in our universe that we just sometimes take for granted, but they're there. So that was part of my thinking when we were talking about putting the service together today, to have something that we could smell, something that we could see, things that we could feel, things that we can touch. Because oftentimes we get into that vein, that vibe, that mode of church where it's a lot of talking. And we do some singing and we listen to someone talk, we do some singing and listen to someone talk. And yet if we want to find creative ways to worship, perhaps there are other things that we can do and other pathways that we can go together that still give us a rich celebration of God's presence and of being in God together. But perhaps there are creative ways that we can do church. And that's certainly been on my mind as Stephen introduced the series last week about some of the values, some of the goalposts, the hooks that we might hang our ideas on to take us forward into 2023. And so my brief today is to talk to you a little bit about creativity in faith and in life. And it's easy, isn't it, to look at the beautiful trees and the beautiful day and the smell of freshly cut grass and the smell of bread and say, isn't God amazing? Isn't God fantastic? It's easy in a way to see God in those really awe-inspiring moments. It's easy to say, yes, there is something intrinsically creative about God, and we're made in God's image, and so we pray and we hope and we believe that there's something intrinsically creative about us. If you're caught in a traffic jam and instead of going along Augusta Road, you decide to pull down a side street, I would call that creativity. Yeah? You're trying to find a new way of doing something. Yeah? If the beams that you lay on my sister's house, Warren, are 10 mil out, what do? You find a creative solution and put a little piece of 10 mil timber underneath to make it fit. So creativity, in one sense, is something that we all have. It's a way of problem solving. It's a way of us approaching the world. And it can be motivated by curiosity. It can be motivated by, I wonder if we could do that slightly differently. It can be motivated by concern. Oh, I'm a little bit worried about Liam and Hannah driving all the way down from Longford. Is there a creative way we can find for them to come down? It can be motivated by a desire for communication. Jing's parents have been living in Hobart with Happy, and from time to time they've also come and stayed with us. And Dad's English is better than my Tagalog. The first word I learned in Tagalog was utut. The Filipinos amongst us know that stands for fart. I really do believe that's a reflection of me, not my wife. I think it's a sad indictment. It was the first word that I learnt. But in my efforts to sort of communicate with Dad, I had to learn a few more. I couldn't just rely on that one, could I? So I had to find creative ways, and so did he, because we both liked to talk, and we'd spent time in the backyard. He was helping me build a shed. He was helping me move garden beds. He was helping me dig holes. We dug a French drain. And there was lots of grunting and pointing and... But we got the job done. Creatively, somehow, we spoke a language beyond Tagalog and beyond English. We spoke a language that we could both understand. So creativity was the core of that. The desire, the motivation was that we wanted to communicate. We wanted to find a way to be together, enjoy each other's presence and get the job done efficiently. So creativity can be defined in a lot of different ways. If you're a fine artist, you'll have certain definitions. If you're a dramatic artist, you'll have a certain kind of definition. If you're a teacher, I think teachers are generally very creative people in the way that they approach children and the way they approach delivering content and working with those people that are in their fold. I think you have to be creative to be a teacher. You've got to find 4 ways to get the job done, not just one. I think the latest people into the fold are the Harvard MBAs. They talk about being creative and innovative in business. And then, of course, we all know that we've got a creative accountant at tax time, don't we? Let's hope not. So I wonder what you see here. It's a little bit far off, I realise, in the picture. So I can tell you that on that raggedy timber table are pieces of shot-up target paper. Someone with a little air pellet BB gun type thing has shot some paper. There's cigarette packets with holes in it. There's cans with holes in it. And I wonder what you see. This is actually a very valuable, very important piece of art by a couple of British artists who went through a bit of a post-punk sort of stage. They do a whole bunch of really interesting, beautiful stuff. But this is a lovely piece of art by Tim Noble and Sue Webster. How would you feel if you'd gone to the T-Mag and found that in the room? Does it look like art? Well, actually, I've only told you 3/4 of the story. Because actually, what happens when you walk into the exhibit is that a light is then turned on, and I wonder if you can see up above there is actually the title of the piece, which is Sunset over Manhattan. So out of all of that daggy, shot up cigarette packets and cans, that rubbish sitting on a rotten old wooden table, Noble and Webster have been able to create this beautiful piece of art that, when reflected with that light and seen in a different way, communicates at a whole different level. And it's not just creative in the sense that, oh wow, they've taken some garbage and made a piece of art out of it. It's creative because it's got layers of metaphor on top of that. What's it saying about the modern city? That when you shine light onto the modern city, we see all the garbage and the detritus and stuff that we would throw out or burn, and yet behind it is that place that we call home. So there are layers and layers of creativity, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I love it. You can spend hours looking at these pictures. Here's another one. So again, we've got a whole bunch of rubbish, and I'm going to read your minds, your collective minds right now, because no longer are you looking at rubbish. Already inside your mind, you're thinking, well, I wonder what this one's going to be. Trying to imagine what it looks like when the light is shone upon it. Am I right? Are some of us thinking that? At least one or two could nod just to give me some affirmation. Thank you. So already we've been trained. We know what to expect. We know, okay, I think I've figured out this game, Sean. And of course you would be right. This particular piece is called Wasted Youth. And I love it. I love it because it is creative in the terms of the way it uses rubbish. I love it because it's creative in the way that it uses metaphor. I love it because I think of some youth sitting in the park outside the Glenorchy Mall, smoking a joint, laying down, wasted. I love it because it's got all those levels of creativity in it. Welcome to Christianity, because I believe this is what God does. God doesn't just look at the sunsets and the beautiful things. You remember those 6 or 8 pictures we had at the very beginning of the service today? He doesn't look at the rivers, the beautiful trees, the sunsets, and see beauty. God sees beauty in the rubbish. And I think that, for me, is a really powerful image of what Christianity is. It's being able to see the world as God sees it and choosing to respond to it. So the story in John 9 is indeed a fantastic story. I love it too, Stephen. I think it's a brilliant story because it is creative at so many levels. Creative in terms of the characters it presents. Creative in the sense that it has different layers and levels of narrative. It is in itself a parable, much like Jesus would have told, which had layers of meaning depending on where you stood, where you sat, what you saw. What did the disciples see in the story? The disciples were freshly minted from the Jordan River Baptist Theological College. And I think in an effort like all of us, when we've been freshly minted out of theological college, we want to impress the teacher. So we ask the theological question. Oh, teacher, who sinned? Was it the dude or was it his parents? You know, clever question, go to the top of the class. And so what does Jesus do? He moves the whole world sideways. He takes the focus away from that question of who sinned and puts the question differently. Invites the disciples to see the world differently. Invites the disciples to see the world the way that he sees the world, the way that God sees the world. And so, as a character in this story, the disciples as a group didn't really see the man beyond someone who had sinned, whether it was him or his parents. So they focused on the fact that, well, someone sinned. Someone did something wrong, that this man is this way. They saw the rubbish on the table. They saw the cigarette packs and the cans all shot up with BB gun. They didn't see the possibility of the Manhattan skyline. They didn't see the possibility of the images of the wasted youth. They didn't see the possibility that God sees in every one of us and that we can manifest in this church. If we be charitable to the disciples, they wanted to understand what the nature of sin was, what the theology was, and how it applied in this particular situation. But actually that wasn't the point. Because the point was for Jesus that he wanted to make this man socially, politically, religiously welcome. Whereas the disciples, at best, wanted to understand before they made the man welcome. And so my theory about how we can think about creative faith and life, particularly in this community, is do we all need to understand the theology and the nature of sin and the nature of redemption and all those things which are super important, they're core to our faith. But do we need to understand them all before we can be made welcome? I think if we see the world as Jesus saw it, we would make people welcome first. Of course, there are other people involved in the story in John 9, and we have the neighbours and the crowd. It's really easy to be part of the crowd, isn't it? You can fade away, you can be anonymous, you don't have to make a decision, you can save it for Facebook when you get home and throw stones from your glass house there. But what did the crowd see in this story? Well, they saw the man they always knew. They saw the man who had been born blind, and they were confused. They were unsure about, well, what's going on here? Is this the same guy? I'm the same man. I'm the same guy. I can just see now. So they saw change, but they experienced confusion. Can we, should we, how will we make this person feel welcome? It used to be easy because we knew where they sat. We knew what the category was. They sat there begging, and that was their place in life. We could understand it. No one had any anxiety because it's like, yep, you're the beggar with the blind. Yep, gotcha. Okay, I'm the cool guy going into the synagogue. Thank you very much. Oh, life is good. But the crowd were being challenged. No one really knew what was going on. No one really knew. Was it this man that was blind? Is this a different man? Is it the same man? How do we process this? They were confused. And so a little bit like the disciples who wanted to understand the theology before they made him welcome, the crowd wanted to understand what's actually going on here. Because when we understand it, when we understand why you're that way and now why you're better, then we can make you welcome. But what does Jesus do? I think Jesus makes you welcome first. The Pharisees got a bit of a slapping from Stephen earlier in the mess service today. What did they see? What did the Pharisees see in this story? Well, they saw the man. They saw the difference. But then immediately, they didn't see him. Because what is the content of their conversation? What is the content of their debate? What is the argument that they have? It's not about the man. It's not about his restoration. It's not about him being welcome in the synagogue. It's not about him being welcome socially, politically and religiously. Because remember, the structure of the world in that time was that the Pharisees had a purview, a play, over all those fields of endeavour and life. They didn't see any of those things. They saw Jesus, the lawbreaker. They saw Jesus who was doing the wrong thing on the Sabbath. They saw Jesus who was a threat to order. And we know the end of the story, don't we? Because he was such a threat to order that in the end they pushed for him to be crucified by the Romans. So it's very clear that these authorities, political, social and religious authorities, did not wish to make anyone welcome. Not the man and certainly not Jesus. So surely in times like these you could turn to your parents. If anyone's going to stick up for me and defend me and support me, I pray today it's my mum and my dad. Actually, I believe they would. But what did the parents of the man see? They saw their son, their boy who had been blind since he was born. So they lived a life with this young man, helping him negotiate his way through life without eyes, in a world where he would not have been welcome, where he would have been left out, cut out, shut out, removed. And so their life would have been a compromise in some ways, because they wouldn't necessarily have been able to take him into the synagogue when they wanted to go in. So the nature of them being welcome was affected by what had happened to the son. So in the story, it actually gets a little sad here, I think, because what the parents then see is not so much their son, but themselves. Because their first defence, their first statement is, well, yes, he's our son, but they were worried about what? They were worried about being made unwelcome by the Pharisees. And so rather than stand up and say, yes, he's our son, he's been healed by Jesus, he can now see, they take 3-4 steps back and say, well, he's old enough to answer for himself. Nice one, parents. Just when the son really needed him, they took a step back because they saw themselves. They were concerned about whether they would be made welcome. He's of age, he can speak for himself. Oh, that sounds great. No, they abandoned him because they didn't want to be made unwelcome. And so Jesus, what did Jesus see? Beginning of the reading that Anne gave for us tells us in one sentence, as Jesus went along, he saw a man who had been blind since birth. Who sinned Jesus? Was it the man or his parents? Neither. Neither. This moment here today, outside of the synagogue with this man who's been blind all his life, is here so that the work of God might be revealed, so that the presence of God might be made real, so that we might know that God welcomes us to relationship. God welcomes us. It's not the theology about sin that the disciples are concerned with. It's not the social concerns about who's in or out of the crowd. It's not whether Jesus was from God or whether he was some sort of demonic presence because he could heal people and he did so on the Sabbath. It's about God's work making people welcome, being restored to him, and by virtue of that, being restored to the social, the political, and the theological and the religious realms of society of the day. He was definitely saved for eternity on that day. Not only was he reconciled to God, but he was made welcome in the town, the dust, the streets in which he lived. So Jesus saw simultaneously, intrinsically, immediately, a man born blind, but a man who was chosen by God to be in relationship with God. Isn't that an incredible thing? Isn't that an incredible thing that Jesus sees humans and us as Tim Noble and Sue Webster saw that pile of rubbish at the beginning of the message? He didn't see someone who was shut out, the detritus, the rubbish of society. He saw someone in whom the work of God could be revealed. A man who was welcome. So creative life and faith for me is living in a way that sees the world as Jesus sees it. We'll come back to that. What about the blind man? What did he see? Nothing. He saw nothing. He was then sent. He was called and he was sent to Siloam, bathing house, after Jesus had applied the saliva in the dirt. What an effort, what an act of creativity that is all by itself. Out of dirt and spit, I make you alive again. Incredible creativity. Restoring a human life for eternity with spit and mud. And so I'm sure that after he went and washed his eyes in the pool, he probably got out and, a little bit like Paul, saw the world a little bit dimly, through a dark glass a little bit, through a mirror, a little bit distorted, a bit fuzzy. You've seen people after an eye operation, you take the bandages off and have you been and had your eyes tested with the drops? No. I'm sure it was like that for a little while as he tried to adjust. And then the Pharisees say to him, okay, look, if you are the same person, who did this? And then he declares what he saw. He said, well, it was the prophet. He saw a prophet. And there was a lot more arguing, of course, and the Pharisees then charged him a second time. Who did you see? Who did this? What can you see? And the man born blind says, I have seen a man from God. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And so this man makes a transition. A man born blind can see nothing. He only can hear Jesus say, go and wash your eyes, and feel Jesus' touch. He then washes his eyes, and the first time he's asked, he says, well, I saw, it's a prophet. And then the second time he's asked, he said, well, actually, this is a real man of God. But then he's asked a third time by Jesus, And he says to him, have you heard about the Son of Man? Do you believe in the Son of Man? And our man, formerly the man born blind, the man who could now see, says, well, where is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, you have now seen him. From nothing, from black to misty after washing in the pool, to a prophet, to a man from God, to God himself. What an incredible transition, what an incredible reconciliation, what an incredibly creative process by which this man was redeemed to the kingdom. And what was his response? Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. I think that's why we worship. Because we recognise that we have been redeemed, welcomed, brought back into relationship with God. And we see that not just at home in those transcendent moments like I've had this weekend, all day yesterday and today, overwhelming almost, that I've got butterflies. Not just in those moments, but in the moments when we're talking with each other, having a cup of tea, helping someone change a flat tyre, going to the shop for someone, asking, how are you? So I think creativity in faith and life is founded upon seeing things as Jesus sees them. But we could extend the metaphor, can't we? Because our sensory way of perceiving the world is one where we can see, where we can feel, where we can taste. Thought we might be able to smell some bread. Where we can think, where we can sense, we can intuit, we can imagine, we can dream. And I think this church is a place where, as a community of people, we can do all of those things. Because we all have different gifts. And amongst us, we can do all of those things to make people feel welcome in the kingdom and welcome among us. I think that we could look at the world and see the detritus, those that are shut out, those who don't have access, those who are abandoned by society, the crowd, their parents, those who are subject to a theological debate before they can be accepted, those people who don't know. I think being welcome is seeing beyond that to what God sees, what Jesus saw in the man formerly known as the man born blind. So I want to rename John chapter 9 as the story not about the man born blind, but the man formerly known as the man born blind. Yep, thank you for those people who know who Prince is and things like that. That helps. And I think that is actually... Oh, I've skipped one, have I? I think that's actually the essence of being a Christian for me. Not only am I created in God's image, but I'm invited to be the reconciler, to be the welcomer. And that can happen only if I see and feel and think and imagine and smell and absorb and intuit the world in the way that Jesus did for this young man. I think that's enough. I've got us a stool. Would you believe?
Thank you. Yes, I do believe, because somebody told me beforehand. Thank you, Sean. Thanks for sharing with us. And knowing you as such a creative man, it's great that you're speaking to us about creativity. First of all, what do you say to those of us, and I include myself in this, who say, I'm not creative? You broaden our idea of creativity at the start, where you talked about things like problem solving as an act of creativity. So what is your response to those of us who feel less creative?
I think creativity is and this is debated, we talk about it a lot when we talk about creativity in the arts, for example, about what it is and whether everyone has access to it. Is it something that you're born with? You know, we say people, she's a natural, you know. But I believe that creativity, we are born with it in terms of that we are born in the image of God. But it's something that we can foster, we can grow, we can nurture. And I think that's a choice. I think, you know, as kids, and this is, you know this from teaching, primary school classrooms are super creative places. Teachers have all different ways and colour and blocks and paintings, and something happens by the time you get to university. You're sitting in a lecture hall listening to a dude talk at you. And so the creativity almost is just reduced out of life. I think creativity is something that we all have access to. I think we're not always aware that we do it. Like the example I gave of, you know, turning off in the traffic or finding another way to show that you care for someone. I can't give Jean flowers every week. I've got to give her a poem every now and then, you know. So I think creativity is something that we can learn and we can develop, and I think that comes from sharing with other people as well.
So when we talk as a church about creatively expressing life and faith, that's not just something for our music team or you know, our Sunday school teachers up top. It's a broader call.
I think so. I think so. It was very easy at the beginning. I took this topic on thinking, oh, well, I could talk about some of the creative things we've tried to do in the worship. So, for example, you know, starting our service today with a set of slides that you could have a look at and identify with visually. I was hoping the smell of bread would permeate the tab. I'll bring 6 bread makers next time. William, are you getting it? Hopefully it'll be ready by morning tea. I'm sorry for the gluten intolerant people. As a church, it goes beyond the songs we sing and the things that people present. It's about how we see each other and interact, and rather than just sticking to the formulaic ways of doing things, being open to the possibility that, well, there might be a different way or a new way, not necessarily better, but different, more effective, who knows.
Thanks, Sean. We have lives that are busy, each in our own way, but just filled with the stuff of life, the stuff that obscures often. How do we make time to be creative and to be involved in God's work and creatively involved in it?
I've gone through a period of immersion, I think, in my own life. Everything I do seems to be, what can I be doing about the kingdom, about the reign of God? But we do need to pay the mortgage and look after the kids and go to the pool and get them from hockey and do all of that. So I think the way that I would practice it at home is those tiny little steps, baby steps. You know, it might be a creative thing to just listen. Michael mentioned that a few weeks ago. Stephen mentioned it again this morning. We're very quick to want to fill the air with words and talk and make a statement, express an opinion. But practicing listening, practicing awareness, knowing where you are in time and space. I've talked here before about being mindful. I'm sorry if I'm struggling with my earpiece now. Being aware of where we are. Seeing people in ways that don't make a judgment first, but actually wait. You know, rather than be offended immediately, I might just go home and then, Scott was so rude to me.
I'm trying not to be, but it's hard. We're called as followers of Jesus to think differently about one another, and that includes both those within our fellowship, brothers and sisters of Christ, but also those beyond. How do we welcome those who've traditionally perhaps felt excluded from churches and marginalised in society? And how do we react with the Pharisees of today when they question us and when we feel that fear of man?
I think the first time I read John 9, I kind of thought, okay, I'm being invited to identify with a particular character. But I think it goes another layer deeper than that, because I wonder if inside all of us, they are kind of aspects of our personality in a way. There are times when I am a bit like the Pharisee. There are times when I want to know the theology, or I want to understand how it fits, or that I'm afraid of identifying with a particular person because it might make me look bad. So I think you can access John 9 at that level of which one do I identify with, and the Pharisees are bad. But I actually think the story, the genius of it in John's Gospel is that it's talking about us as whole people and recognising that we have a shadow, recognising that we have our dark moments. And so in answer to your question, it's not just the blunt thing of saying, oh, well, we should be open walls and anyone who wants, we accept them regardless of judgment or affirmation or anything like that. It's about recognising that in us, we have the capacity to isolate and shun people out. And that could be because of their age, it could be of their gender, it could be of their ability, it could be of their gendered choices, whatever. I don't think it's any secret that I'm very keen for an open church where everyone feels accepted, recognising that that's challenging for us because the more diversity, the more difference we have. We've got to negotiate different characters and different people, and yet that's what I believe God's called us to do.
Thanks, Sean. At the end of the chapter that we were reading, Jesus talks about judgment. And how do we balance that? How does that work with that idea of welcome?
Yeah. I left that verse out of the Bible reading, you noticed. I think judgment is one of those words that, a little bit like sin, we've got to be careful. There's assumptions built into what it means and how we use it. And so I think in some ways, one easy way to translate the gospel, I once heard a gentleman say, the gospel's easy. You just say to people, turn or you burn. By which he meant, change your life around or you'll go to hell. I don't think that's ever actually really been true in terms of, that Jesus came, that God comes to judge us in a way of punishing us for a bad life or whatever. I think judgment is about assessment, it's about evaluation, it's about understanding the full context of your life. That's why we go to court and have a jury of our peers of 12 people, not just one person making an edict. And I think, God, the term judgment is a much broader, a much more open term. It's about thinking about the balance of your life and everything that you've done and who you are. And as we know from the story of John 9, Jesus' disciples didn't have the perfect theology. They didn't know what sin was. So can they be held to account in a kind of authoritarian, judgmental way that says, well, you didn't know the truth, so you don't belong either? I think God's got a bigger, wider purview than that. And judgment is something that's not as perhaps narrowly defined as we've put in the past. But there was a very good reason why I left that verse out, and that was because I was trying to dodge it today.
Well, somebody's called you to account. And ultimately, we have the person of Jesus, don't we, who has come to bring restoration and salvation and that way through to God.
This is the incredible thing, isn't it? That when I saw that painting, the first one by Tim Noble and Sue Webster, it really did strike me that I'm that shot-up, broken tin can cigarette packet dude. And yet Jesus went beyond that. And I've said before, that's not good news, that's incredible news. And I feel reconciled to God, I feel reconciled to the environment that we live in because of the actions, the words, the stories about that one man. I think Jesus has changed it for all of us. And so categories like sin, categories like judgment are always filtered through what Jesus did for us.
Thank you, Sean. I am smelling the bread now. And that's perhaps a call for us to morning tea. But thank you for the stool. We're going to stand and sing together now, When Morning Gilds the Skies.